Hello and welcome to today's web seminar, 5 Things You Need to Know About Quality-Driven DevOps in 2017, sponsored by Turnkey Solutions and featuring Dan Gannon, President and CEO at Turnkey Solutions. I'm your host and moderator, Josiah Renaudin. Thank you for joining us today. Before I hand it off to the speaker, let me explain the controls on this console. If you experience any technical issues, please send a note through the question field located beneath the panels, and we'll be on hand to help as quickly as possible. Our responses can be read in the Q&A panel to the left of the slides. This is also the same way to submit questions. We welcome all comments and inquiries during today's event, so feel free to ask as many as you'd like, and we'll answer as many as possible during the Q&A session after the presentation. Today's event contains polling questions, which can be answered within the slide view. To optimize your bandwidth for the best viewing experience possible, please close out any unnecessary applications that may be running in the background. At the bottom of your console is a widget toolbar. These widgets open panels. The console opens with 3 on your screen: the speaker, Q&A, and the slide panels. All of these panels can be moved around and resized to your liking. If you accidentally close one, click the respective widget to reopen the panel in its original place. Hover your cursor over these icons to reveal labels identifying each widget. Through these icons, you can download the speaker slides and white papers, as well as share this event with friends and colleagues. This event is being recorded and will be made available for on-demand viewing. Once the recording is ready, you'll receive an email with instructions on how to access the presentation and slides on demand. With that said, I'd like to introduce and pass controls to our speaker, Dan.
Thank you very much, Josiah. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to talk about 5 important things that we think you need to know about quality-driven DevOps in 2017. Without further ado, we'll jump right in. I think, as you may know, my name is Daniel Gannon, President and CEO of Turnkey Solutions. We're a Denver, Colorado-based software company focused on DevOps solutions, quality management, and test data management. So before we get into the heart of the presentation, we're going to sprinkle some questions throughout so we get a better sense of the audience experience and some of the challenges that people have around DevOps, DevOps testing, quality management. So as you can see, there's a polling question here. I'd love to see your responses on your DevOps testing initiatives. What are they focused on? Is it primarily new applications, existing applications, or is it both? We're going to give it just a minute for people to get a chance to respond. We'll have some of these questions throughout, and again, it'll help frame our discussion today as we kind of work through the intricacies and challenges of DevOps testing and quality-driven DevOps and test data management. So lots of responses rolling in. Give this just another few more seconds. Good. Well, it looks like there are people across the entire spectrum, but the vast majority, I show 70%, are really applying DevOps principles and initiatives to both the new application and existing application for lifecycle management streams. And it's pretty healthy showing in terms of the growth of these kinds of initiatives and how they're being applied, not just to new development, but to existing applications as well. So we're going to reference back to this as we go through the presentation and talk about some of the things that affect both of those different types of streams slightly differently. So let's talk about DevOps testing. Obviously, the core concept behind DevOps, I mean, very put simply, is it's a digital transformation imperative, and the entire concept is around how do we speed time to market, speed time to various releases. And, it's a complex and very costly process to do that, particularly when you talk about enterprise applications. So the more complex the application, the greater the challenge there. And so some of the things that we find that people encounter, some of the challenges fall into a few categories. The first I call, lack of visibility. When you start to work on accelerated changes, particularly to existing applications, so less so with net new applications, you find that as you break down the process, that it becomes challenging to keep a focus on the end-to-end process, the entire process, rather than the specific pieces that are being worked on. So visibility becomes impaired somewhat without this optic view of what the entire business process is. Secondly, data and data provisioning, particularly secure data, it becomes very challenging. And we're going to talk quite a bit about the role of test data and on-demand provisioning of test data and how it really is sort of what I call the lifeblood or the oxygen of the process. And in a truly integrated, quality-driven DevOps environment where quality has been embedded in the process, to have teams waiting for relevant test data that's secure to complete the testing process grinds the whole process to a halt and, completely, invalidates the entire concept of trying to do things faster. So we find an increasing role for on-demand secure test data provisioning to support and meaningfully enable this DevOps process. And lastly, this whole notion of time and speed of delivery can be also significantly hampered by some of the sort of what I'll call old school methods for managing the quality process. So having a significant offshore manual presence isn't really DevOps. The increased pressure to get security updates and upgrades into production on your applications can also significantly impact the DevOps process. All of these things have to be taken into consideration as you build your process and you weave quality into the DevOps process. And of course, without having quality woven into that process, it really looks more like Agile than it does DevOps. So this is really a critical element of the DevOps concept. So we talked about 5 things. So let's dive right into those 5. So number 1, there's still a danger of silos, even in an integrated effort that DevOps really represents. And the reason for that is that a typical DevOps initiative, almost always involves multiple concurrent teams that are working on particular parts of a release and delivering software changes. And of course, the pressure is, and the purpose for this is to deliver faster than, we have before. However, due to basically a number of different factors, it might be skills, it might be time available of certain resource or limitations of resource types, they only focus on the test part of their particular part of the process. And stitching those together and having it work from an end-to-end process perspective isn't a given. And we find that a number of companies struggle with this process of how do I pull it all together and have this assurance that my end-to-end business process, which almost always traverses different application types, different technologies, how do we ensure that that works at the end of the process? So be careful, beware of the danger of silos even while in this sort of integrated process. The second thing is that manual testing just doesn't get you there. Of course, developers and testers have a reasonably small window to test in. And most commonly, there's a single tester assigned to a given sprint team. And, finding a way for that individual to write all the relevant test cases and provision the test data, update old test cases in a short window is clearly unrealistic. And the result of that is, in many cases, that the testing is compromised. You find that it's very narrowly focused, kind of happy path, minimal amount in order to get through, and not the robust kind of testing that's going to ensure that the quality quotient is achieved at the end of the process. Number three, if that isn't managed properly, as we all know, reality hits you in production. And we also find that one of the great delimiters, as we just talked about, is speed and integrity of secure test data being provisioned on demand to continue to drive that process. I've seen many teams that had the issue where they were waiting for test data to complete their process in the testing process in a sprint and simply just moved on because they didn't have the luxury of just waiting. So what happens when you can't complete this process due to the lack of test data being provisioned as necessary on demand is that you find those problems when you go to production. And again, it really compromises the whole purpose of doing DevOps to begin with. We find this increasing role of data as an enabler. Next, number four, we just watch out for faster code generating potentially poorer quality. So again, if we haven't focused on the relative strength of the quality part of the process, I like to say sometimes speed kills. While we really are after speed and improving delivery, without taking into account the requirement to weave quality into that process, it just simply results in a bad release happening faster. So DevOps success really depends on, a number of things, but robust continuous delivery framework, which in turn also relies upon continuous testing capabilities. And without that, it just simply results in faster code with poor quality and greater business risk. So lastly, we think one of the big sea changes in 2017 and beyond is the role of open source and just a wide variety of tools. And there are any number of these that are being used across the spectrum of many organizations for a number of different purposes. But as it relates to DevOps, we find that open source scripting is becoming widely adopted, and without the right tools for the right applications and in support of DevOps initiatives, once again, quality falters and people lapse back into more of an agile development environment. The ability to pull all of these disparate tools, whether they be open source or COTS software applications, requires a robust automation framework that can pull it all together and sustain that. So they have to be unified if you really want to maintain any sort of integrity to the end-to-end business process. So people and teams that are using different tools somehow have to be unified into a framework that can support all of those things. So we find that to be one of the newest issues that people grapple with as they roll out DevOps and take advantage of the variety of tools that are available. So let's jump into another polling question. So which of those that we just talked about, which of those issues are the highest priority for your organization? Again, we'll give it a couple of minutes here to let people respond. Okay, we'll give it another 30 seconds. So get All right, well, the survey says everybody wants their cake and eat it too. So we want to deploy faster but keep quality high. And again, this seems to be of course, the objective, but also the challenge. And so we'll talk a little bit further about some of the ways that we can make that a reality and achieve that. So the DevOps quality challenge, how do we go faster but not sacrifice, but actually enhance quality. I look at this as taking place across three distinct phases, if you will, in the DevOps process. And the first is the continuous integration, sort of build quality, the build part of the equation. And there's a couple of graphics there that I'm sure everyone's familiar with from a process perspective, so I won't labor on that. But we find that what customers articulate to us that their challenges are to create automated smoke tests for each of those builds. And then that smoke test suite should, in fact, grow with each sprint, right? And there are a number of test integration build tools that are available there. But the need is to test those new features. And we believe that in order to really achieve sort of DevOps as defined, it really requires automation to do that. You can't do that manually and meet that speed requirement and meet the high quality requirement. And of course, in order to do that, one of the distinct requirements is to have fresh, secure, representative test data on demand for all the above. To achieve that speed, it has to be on demand. It has to be secure so that it doesn't risk any confidential customer-related information, et cetera, and be representative for that stage of the build. So that's the build phase of the equation. Second sort of distinct phase is, continuous testing phase. Sprint quality is my term for that. And the challenges there are somewhat different. Integration testing, system tests, you have to do a full functional test at this stage. And these are all required if you want to ensure that, the sprint release has sufficient quality. Again, just as in the build phase, the automated test suite will grow with each sprint, and integration testing takes place across sprint teams, across the entire spectrum. Again, we start to see this end-to-end business process focus take place. Of course, you need to test those new features, and again, highly recommended you doing this in automated fashion so that, again, we maintain speed without sacrificing the quality that we just talked about in that last polling question. Automated regression testing takes place here. And again, as we've seen previously, for all these tests, you have to have fresh, secure, representative test data in order to do this. And it has to be done on demand, or once again, the process stalls and we lose all the benefit from the speed perspective that we gained from being in a DevOps process. And lastly, continuous deployment stage or phase, if you will. So staging quality. So this is pre-production, continuous deployment. Deploy to your staging environment just prior to deploying to production. Sort of the final step, last big step before you actually have the impact, full impact to customers, users, every constituency that's going to be exposed to your application. There's a need, actual requirement for full automated regression test suite here, and increasingly risk-based testing so you can single out the areas that are affected and ensure that proper testing and very thorough testing is done on high-risk areas. You'll want to have dynamically configurable automated regression test suites in a framework that can support the level of complexity of your application. The test data that you need in this particular phase is really quite different. You need production-like data. Although use of production data, and we'll talk about this downstream, isn't necessarily recommended, but the ability to provision data, subset mask, use synthetic data so that you don't expose critical, secure information is very, very important. And of course, at the end, this is the end stage, you need to support any and all types of user acceptance testing in this continuous deployment phase. So the quality process is different by phase. Some of the needs are different by phase. The testing types are different by phase. And in the case of the staging phase, the test data that's required is different than the earlier stages. So another polling question, who is ultimately responsible for the integrity of the business process end-to-end in your organization? So again, not the silo, not the limited part of the application, but who owns sort of the end-to-end process to make sure that everything works as designed at the end of the development process. It's another 30 seconds. Okay. As you can see the results here. The largest response is the application owner, followed by QA. And I think this is, having done similar presentations over the last 10 years, I think this is a little bit of a sea change where quality and the integrity of the end-to-end business process was once the province almost exclusively of QA, and things have evolved as the shift left of the QA process gets moved into the DevOps process, if you will, and you start to see collaborative ownership and more than one owner, really, where it's not just the QA individual, but also the application owner, ultimately rolling up to executives, but you find this team concept of ownership as you move into the sort of integrated team concept of DevOps. So I see a combination of QA and application owner at the end of the day owning the business process. So let's talk about how to actually transform DevOps quality and achieve some of these objectives that we've talked about thus far. So as we've alluded to, I believe that the end-to-end business process assurance process is absolutely paramount for the success of DevOps. It doesn't take many failures of the actual end-to-end process, to have production outages to really sort of cripple these initiatives. So assuring that the entire end-to-end process works, not just the silo that's being worked on, is critically important. And this tends to exhibit itself much more in complex applications than, of course, simpler applications. In particularly enterprise applications that, like ERP applications or CRM applications, other package applications that are almost always integrated with other applications, the web applications, mobile increasingly. The process of testing that from an end-to-end perspective can be very complex. It's absolutely necessary for this process to work and for DevOps to support those more complex environments. Having an automation framework that can support automation for a broad variety of application types and degrees of complexity, but is also nimble and can support the DevOps process and quickly work for people across in those teams versus just simply being a tool for, technical QA automation engineers is really critically important. There's no reasonable expectation that developers and other people in the DevOps team are going to go learn the unique scripting languages of a variety of testing tools. So having tools that are easily used, consumed, and managed by a variety of different individuals in this process that can support the complexity of your application set really is essential. And testing without that framework really, I think, represents a very significant risk that you lose the quality component in the DevOps journey. So, of course, continuous testing. Testing is no longer sort of the end part of the process, but woven throughout sort of the fabric of the DevOps process. And continuous delivery really is going to rely on continuous testing. and the notion that we'll develop and then throw it over the wall to QA, have that QA team sort everything out and approve it isn't really the spirit of the DevOps. It really is more of an agile sort of development process. And in order to do this, again, this does come back to having the right tooling necessary to support this from a concept perspective. So continuous testing and continuous delivery are all really foundational elements of DevOps. And we think increasingly open source testing is becoming important. The ability to support those tools in this framework that may contain a number of other tools is very, very important. And we find increasingly, as an example, Selenium being widely adopted and used for web applications. However, if it's siloed and doesn't play well with your other test automation tools or plug into your framework, then you're creating these barriers to this seamless integration, seamless testing process, continuous testing process that we want to achieve. So we find increasingly this idea of embracing a wide variety of technologies and tools that are purpose-built for certain types of applications and testing is really critically important going forward. Then finally, test data. Just simple test data scenarios or stale old test data, the wrong data, or more importantly, waiting for test data while in a DevOps sprint and having that have substantial impact to the speed that is the purpose of the initiative really leads to issues in production. It forces you into taking risks, cutting corners, and ultimately either choosing speed or choosing quality, but not getting both. And we know from our previous polling question that the vast majority of respondents indicated that both was their really ideal state. So it really requires that this be addressed in a meaningful way. So some of the unique enablers for DevOps quality that Turnkey brings to the table. If you look at our business process assurance framework, there are assets that support a wide variety of business process applications, technologies, technology types, and it's the concept of an end-to-end business process that has to be assured is really consisting of any number, really unlimited number of applications, application types, different technologies, all running cross-platform to give an end-to-end business process to a user constituency, then it really has to support everything, all of those things. We do that with our patented C-Factory automation framework. We'll talk a little bit about that in upcoming slides. And underpinning all that is we've identified one of the critical elements is data. We have patented technology of our own, but we've also partnered with CA Technologies and their TDM framework to provision quality on-demand data. And so we're going to dig into those things. But we think that these are the enablers from a tooling and technology framework perspective that are really necessary to drive DevOps quality. Take a look at the framework itself. So as I mentioned, test data, I alternatively call this the lifeblood or the oxygen of the test process. It is interesting when I've spoken with numerous teams that describe this environment where they had really built out a very, very impressive DevOps environment, and they've really embraced the principles. Teamwork is in place, and the entire process comes to a screeching halt because they're at the test phase and they're waiting for the test data team to produce data. And this might take minutes, it may take hours, and it may take days. And the data produced is not the right data. It isn't representative of the tests that need to be developed. If it risks, it isn't secure, and may in fact expose personal information, then these represent really, really substantial barriers to successful DevOps, in particular at the time equation. And, what I've found is that generally if people are held waiting for test data and the test data team can't produce on a timely basis, they simply move on. They do minimal manual testing with whatever data can be produced and check that box and move on with an obvious corresponding substantial risk to the end result. So when you look at things like manual data sheet population, lack of real-world test scenarios in the data, if there's not reuse of data sets, if it doesn't maintain referential integrity throughout the process so that you can do a meaningful end-to-end business process test, or if you're spending all kinds of time searching for the right data, your DevOps initiative, quality-driven DevOps initiative, is likely to fail. So this is a really, really critical element and really drives the process. We solve that in we think, a really, really elegant way by having a data-driven test automation framework coupled with the industry's most robust test data management, test data provisioning technology from CA. We'll get into some additional detail on that. Our C-Factory technology is a very unique test automation framework. It is a patented data-driven architecture that intelligently will understand every field in an application, every field that can be interacted, the field type, the data type, all the properties of that, which can then be modeled and have the data itself modeled, so you know what data needs to be provisioned, what type of data, and whether it be synthetically generated, whether it be a subset of production data that's been masked and subsetted, or done through SQL calls. That data can be automatically injected into the data framework that's used and consumed in the testing process. So our data driver technology will build these this essentially data containers that encapsulates the entire business process, and then we feed that with data that's provisioned through TDM. And this data-driven architecture accomplishes a few other really important things. From a end-to-end business process perspective, it's critical that you have the ability to test all of the business logic in an application. So not just maybe the most common way that an application is traversed, but rather all of the different ways that an application might be used, so that you don't find a case where your primary business process works, but less likely to be used cases fail because they weren't tested. So this data-driven architecture and the intelligent use of data to drive the test process enables you to test much more of your application, sort of wider and deeper, with many fewer test cases, and of course doing this without writing any code. This really supports this end-to-end business process assurance concept that we've talked about. Let's talk about that for a minute. What do I mean by an end-to-end business process? And what is it that we're trying to assure and ensure quality of? A typical example would be order to cash, or it could be hire to retire, it could be procure to pay. Any of these sort of macro business processes, and particularly in large companies, this encompasses and become very, very critical in the operation of the business. And if you think about the complexity of these applications, it isn't uncommon for there to be literally thousands or even tens of thousands of ways that you can actually traverse an application from one end to the other. So having an automation framework and the ability to provision test data to accommodate that level of complexity and that number of different scenarios can be quite a daunting task. So you really need, if you want to accomplish this objective, automation that in fact can keep pace with not just the complexity of the application, but keep pace with your DevOps process and provision the correct data and provide the tools necessary to give you the ability to test through all those three different phases that we talked about earlier, and support this degree of complexity across a wide range of applications. Some of these are package applications. Others may be bespoke applications. Some are integrated with customers and other third-party suppliers. But all of these represent a complete end-to-end process that should be tested completely to ensure that it all works. And again, the danger is as we develop faster, as we embrace DevOps initiatives, that if it doesn't really take into consideration the needs for this complete end-to-end process, and we lapse into some of these silos, then we can have really substantially different results than those that we had set out to achieve. So we kind of went through these 5 points earlier, and just to use this as a summarization point, this is the way that we set out to transform DevOps quality by taking into account this end-to-end business process concept and focusing not just on the piece parts of the sprints, but rather making sure that we pull all that together and are able to provide sort of the quality-driven DevOps required to support complex end-to-end business processes. And you find that these are really the backbone of most major corporations. So doing that without an automation framework raises the application risk, and I think that this increases over time as we see the rise of other types of technologies that are used in a variety of different DevOps initiatives. It requires that we use in the continuous testing process. It requires that this automation framework be able to support those. So open source testing, but not just open source, but again, a wide range of other vendor-driven tools that have specific uses and specific application types, still to be managed by a single automation framework that has this view of end-to-end business process. And then, of course, finally, as we've strongly alluded to, test data is absolutely essential to this process. The failure to have the ability to provision on-demand, relevant, and secure test data to inject into that process will significantly slow or derail quality-driven DevOps and sort of drive it back to more of an agile development environment. And so the ability to do this without exposing and creating risk by using sort of open production data is really critical. So, the ability to do that also is transformative from the perspective of making DevOps really work in the way it's intended. Just a quick customer snapshot. So we've got numerous cases where, of course, people have embraced these ideas and used the tools to achieve the objectives that we're talking about. And Allmac is a life sciences company based in Northern Ireland, and had some really, really substantial challenges in terms of managing their end-to-end business process and their package application environment. And a typical scenario for an end-to-end regression testing process was typically upwards of 20 people for over a course of 12 weeks. And as you might imagine, these applications continue to change during that time. Nothing is static. So in addition to that, had to deal with the ongoing changes that occurred throughout the process. By adopting these principles, both sort of the DevOps principles and the focus on end-to-end business process assurance, we were able to reduce that to, depending upon the size, complexity of the release, 1 to 2 people over the course of 2 to 3 days. So really, really substantial change in their operating environment. As Brendan likes to say, test automation with C-Factory key to their DevOps and larger strategy of continuous delivery. And it's been game-changing from a business perspective. Of course, this isn't just Allmac that's achieved these, a wide variety of customers of all sizes in virtually every industry all across the globe have really taken the same approach and achieved similar results. And as we find that people move from more traditional development platforms and processes to embrace DevOps and achieve that idea that we talked about in the polling question of faster delivery, but not sacrificing quality, but actually improving quality, it really requires that we pull together all of these different concepts and tie that into a framework that enables people to achieve speed, but improve quality. And with that, I'm going to open the floor to questions. And
all right.
we can talk about some of these ideas.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan. Before we start Q&A, remember you can ask Dan questions by typing them in the field beneath the panels and by clicking the Submit button. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible, but for those questions we're unable to answer during the live Q&A, some will be answered offline. All right. Let's start here with this one. This person says, we use production data refresh every quarter for testing purposes. Why do we need a different test data framework?
Well, that's a great question. There are a lot of different strategies for producing test data. And this is, one of the more common ways that people do that. But using production data, on a quarterly basis, while it may serve some needs, it certainly isn't and won't be comprehensive. So the big issue that comes to mind immediately is that production data can contain PII, personal information, which is, I think, personally just generally not a great practice, right? I mean, we're all familiar with a variety of data breaches, data issues, and I think exposing, some live data with sensitive information has, all kinds of downstream implications that are possible. The other problem is that production data that's produced on a quarterly basis can become stale. And again, if we're trying to shorten our cycles and sprints, I mean, you can envision that many DevOps sprint initiatives are going to happen inside of a quarter, and waiting for, fresh data isn't clearly an option here. And, it can inhibit the whole speed. The other problem you run into, quite frankly, is that production data isn't going to address the needs of new features and functions and new data elements in your application. So if in fact the changes mean that there are new data fields, old production data isn't going to have that. So it won't be, even if you kind of pencil that in, it doesn't maintain referential integrity. So you can't really test these complex business processes that contain new features, new data fields, et cetera, if you're using old data. I mean, it really, really hampers that. So we approach it a little bit differently. Our test data framework addresses kind of all those issues. It gives you the ability to provide or develop or create synthetic test data, which eliminates the need for production data and obviously solves the concern about PII. You can also generate then test data for new features and functions, kind of those new applications, kind of eliminates that gap. And you can do it in such a way that you can maintain that referential integrity when you test in an end-to-end business process. So again, I think a lot of people have employed a lot of different ways to create test data based upon the tools that were available at the time. But we have a lot more capabilities today than we did, I think before.
All right, thanks so much for the explanation. We have another good one right here. This person asks, we have so many tools already in our DevOps framework. Turnkey would be another tool. Why would we add more tools?
Well, as long as it's our tools, we don't mind. No, just kidding. Listen, I think overall quality and business risk, isn't really determined based on how many tools you have, but it's really all about having the right tool for the right job and the right framework. So I think there are so many use-specific tools available today that can actually deliver pretty substantial results that, again, we actually recommend that there's a wide variety of tools that can be employed based upon a wide variety of factors. But it's really all about having the right tools in place and the right framework in which all these can coexist. So, of course, we believe that Turnkey is an essential tool. It, really addresses the quality needs across all of those different phases we talked about, the daily builds, whether it be bi-weekly, whatever the timing is, sprints, and then ultimately staging and your software releases. So having one tool that you can sort of use to unify that ensures that your teams are focused or delivering high quality software consistently in a common way. And we think that those are all really, really important points. But, you know, there are a lot of tools, and some of them are terribly useful for very specific purposes and can still fit into this framework concept.
All right, thanks so much. Next question over here. This person asked, we already do smoke tests during our build process. Why do we need a different framework?
That's another really, really good question. I mean, you know, smoke tests, of course, are almost always done, right? But, you know, the smoke tests and the build tests are best used as a repeatable activity rather than, you know, done, you know, each time from scratch. So as builds are happening continuously, you know, that as that goes on, it's important that you have a good framework in place so you can expand your smoke tests as they're needed and repeat it with sort of the right test data at that time so you can consistently find issues. So again, this is a concept of reusability, repeatability, and expansion. So when you do a smoke test, these can build on each other and give you broader, deeper sort of coverage. So ad hoc smoke tests are, you know, I mean, the reality is they're only as good as the individual tester or developer that are performing it, right? You know, haven't codified that in software. And, you know, I think most application owners that we said are responsible for overall quality or QA people, you know, may not be content to rely on the sort of the individual capabilities of a person and you know how they do it, but rather a framework that can ensure that you have consistent process, you know, across all of that. So if you don't, it results in sort of poorer overall quality, and a good framework like Turnkey addresses it and contributes to improving the overall quality. And I think that's really what it comes down to, again, is this notion of a framework that, you know, supports all of this and supports reusability. Okay?
All right, great. We have another good one here that I think you probably get pretty often. This person asks, can Turnkey be used across both Agile and Waterfall, or does the methodology make no difference?
It can be used across either. Virtually, we've probably seen every sort of methodology employed, a lot of hybrid methodologies. But yeah, absolutely can be used across any sort of methodology that is employed. And in fact, many people use the same tools in the same environment where they have certain applications. They're doing Agile or DevOps, if you will. Others are still Waterfall. Depends on the group. There can be different projects, different applications that are managed differently. The tools support all of those. I think what's important, though, is it does give you the ability to do things faster, more intelligently, with less technical overhead. And, you know, those benefits in you regardless of your methodology type.
All right, great. We have time for just a few more questions. So just remember, if you have anything you'd like to ask Dan, you could type that in the Q&A box. This person asks, does this data-driven framework allow us to mask the data to protect data confidentiality of the business application?
Absolutely, yeah, it's a critical function. So masking, subsetting, synthetically generating data, you know, whatever is required to achieve that confidentiality and privacy and have your data be secure is critically important. Now, it isn't required. I mean, you can still do SQL calls to databases. You can still use production data. But, you know, the way that we would, you know, generally recommend that this gets deployed is you look at each of these data types and determine which of these represent risk. And then you know, have a whole bunch of different methodologies in your bag, if you will, to address those. Find the data types that really do represent risk and either mask, synthetically generate those data fields so that you don't have this exposure.
All right. This person asks, can your solutions be hosted in a private cloud-like environment?
Yes, you can. Absolutely.
All right, great.
And I have a question here that just came across, if you don't mind.
Yep, sure, go ahead.
This is pretty good, yeah. Says, our developers directly deploy to production. We don't have staging as a separate activity. So, how do we deal with that? My take on that is, there's all the more reason to find defects early and address them early, right? I mean, if you're going to directly deploy to production, and I have that staging phase that I talked about, then you really got to make sure that you have the right quality. Otherwise, you have users, whether it be internal or external, doing some level of testing for you. So, we think that, it really means, you need to find defects early, address them early on. If you don't have staging, then that reliance on early phase testing process we talked about, build test, sprint test, has to be rock solid. And I just don't see how you do that manually. You need a robust automation framework like that one that we provide in order to really make sure that that gets accomplished.
All right, fantastic. So that'll actually close our Q&A for the day. Just a quick reminder, you can download different white papers, PDFs, and links from Turnkey. There's a widget at the bottom of your screen called Additional Resources. So if you press that now, you can download that. Move over here. And as I said, that ends our event for today. I'd like to thank Dan for his time. I'd like to thank Turnkey for sponsoring this event. Also, a special thank you goes out to you, the audience, for spending the last hour with us. Have a great day, and we hope to see you at a future event.